Good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson School. And also welcome to today's talk, Deciding by Default, Lessons from Behavioral Economics by Cass Sunstein. I first met Cass in the early days of the Obama administration and can attest that he actually could have given a talk on many, many topics today. He's been called a polymath, and his far-ranging interests and expertise confirm that label. He's currently heading up Harvard Law School's new program in behavioral economics and public policy, in addition to teaching at the law school as the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law. This follows about 3.5 years in the Obama administration, where he was the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, affectionately known as OIRA. For those not familiar with OIRA, it's actually one of the really most important policymaking bodies in the federal government. It reviews federal regulations and oversees the rulemaking process, reducing paperwork burdens and overseeing the implementation of government-wide policies in the areas of information technology, information policy, privacy, and statistical policy. The breadth of expertise required for this position, charged with examining regulatory issues across all of the federal government and considering the costs and benefits of the proposed regulations, is huge. Two of the higher profile areas in which Cass was overseeing regulations was, implementation of the Affordable Care Act. How many pages of regulation did that require, Cass?
More than 2.
More than 2 pages. I saw him like that weekend after, the Monday afterwards, and he said, I just counted them up. It was going to be a long haul, as well as financial regulatory reform. He's the author of hundreds of articles and books. Some of you may know him from his influential book called Nudge, in which he argued that individuals could be nudged into rational behavior by taking advantage of some aspects of human nature. Cass graduated from Harvard College in 1975 and from Harvard Law School in 1978. Upon graduation, he clerked for Justice Benjamin Kaplan of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and then Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. He then went on to work as attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel in the U.S. Justice Department, and then as a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. So I introduce to you today, Cass Sunstein.
Wow, thank you for coming. And I've actually never spoken to an overflow room, so this is really maybe the most exciting moment of my life. Hello? Hello, overflow room. Can you just cry out default rule so we can all hear you? We kind of heard you. Okay. I'm thrilled to be here also because, well, I'll tell you an anecdote that'll capture it. When I was first almost dating my now wife, Samantha Power, I was a big fan of the Wilson School. We were texting, not that kind of texting. It was kind of innocent with maybe a mild flirtation in it, I hoped. And she was stuck in a snowstorm in Boston, and I was stuck in a snowstorm in Chicago or Washington or something. And I was having a lot of fun in this exchange, which had humor and budding affection in it. And I said, isn't this great? And she responded, you have to get out more. Well, I've been in the federal government up until recently for 3.5 years, and now I'm out more. So to be here and to be out is really great. I'm not going to talk in these prepared remarks at all really about what happened in the Obama administration in this domain, but I will just alert you to the fact that the sensible use of default rules to try to ease and simplify people's choices did make its mark. And I'll give you some particulars, if you like, during the question and answer. It's something that people are acutely interested in. Many people in the United States and all over the world are interested in green energy. In fact, they say they choose green energy if they got the choice, but they just don't. In Germany, approximately 1% of people have green energy, with the exception of 2 places in Germany, 2 counties where the rate of people who have green energy is over 90%. You might ask yourself, how come? Is that an area of Germany that's just really, really green in remarkable cultural contrast to the rest of Germany. It's actually not so. The only evident difference between where it's 1% and over 90 is that in those two counties, the default rule is green energy. You have to switch to get what's sometimes called gray energy. There's also been a remarkable natural experiment involving Austria and Germany. The only other time I'm going to mention the nation of Germany. In Germany, about 12% of people consent to be organ donors. In Austria, the rate is over 99%. Now, these are adjacent nations, and it's an interesting puzzle on which much ink could be spilled trying to explain why it is that Austrians are so pro-organ donation compared to their German neighbors. If you investigate the situation, it appears that there's nothing involving cultural or education or altruism or life-saving that distinguishes the two nations. It's just that there's a default rule in favor of organ donation in Austria. You have to opt out. And in Germany, it's like the United States. You have to opt in to organ donation, and that's driving the difference. In many places in the United States, coming back to home, there's been a striking development in the sense that people are saving money for their retirement. And this actually preceded the recession, which got people nervous, of course, about having enough money. The difference between those private employers who are showing very high and early participation rates in 401k programs and those that aren't is just one thing, the default rule. If you automatically plan, even if it is like that, if people have to sign up, the enrollment rate is a lot lower. Even if opting in is also like that. The people who devise default rules, and this is my topic here, are choice architects in the sense that they create the social background against which choices are made. Every social situation, if you go into a cafeteria, if you open the OIRA website, and I hope you have recently gone to the OIRA website. If you go into a movie theater, everyone has a choice architecture behind it in the sense that social norms, available information, what's accessible and what's not, what you are defaulted into are an architecture. They create nudges in the sense that they affect your choices even if your freedom isn't adversely affected in any way. Whether people can opt in or can opt out, a default rule allows people to go their own way if they wish. What is striking and a bit mysterious is that despite their keeping freedom unaffected, the default rules tend to be very sticky. And if there's one point to fix in your mind in these remarks, it's the immense power of the default rule in affecting social outcomes. With respect to healthcare, consumer protection, the availability of organs, energy use and environmental protection, savings, and a lot more, the choice of the default rule may turn out to be the most important decision a private or public institution makes. I'm going to try to achieve two goals in these remarks. The first is to try to give a kind of a state-of-the-art account of what we know and what we don't know about default rules, about when they're sticky, when they're not, and exactly why. And to get a little bit ahead of the story, there's only one domain of which I'm aware in which default rules pervasively don't stick, and that's marital names. Women are defaulted into, after marriage, the same name they had when they got married. But women change the default. Men don't. That's an interesting puzzle. It's an interesting counterexample to the general point I'm making. I'm going to try to give a sense of what lies behind that story. The second goal is to try to make some progress in understanding a frontiers issue. That is a kind of, I'm going to try to paint, don't be scared, even though I am a pathetic painter and a scary painter. I'm going to do the equivalent, as lectures go, of painting a triptych, which three little panels. And the panels consist of impersonal default rules of the sort that my three examples exemplify, a default rule that applies to the whole of a population. Second, active choosing by which people aren't defaulted into anything at all, but are told, you have to decide, you have to, where the sanction for non-decision is something so evidently terrible that people are going to decide. And I hope you can see just off the bat that the choice between the impersonal default rule, saying your energy is going to be green, and active choosing, you have to make that decision, that's going to matter. And in some cases, active choosing will seem not only freedom promoting, but very important, because the impersonal default rule will stick and might not fit a diverse population. And in other cases, the impersonal default rule will seem like a blessing and a relief, because active choosing would be a nightmare given the technical and difficult nature of the choice which might be forced on people. And that song is because of the happiness of this particular topic. Is that coming from me? I don't think so. It's nice, though. The third part of the triptych is a wave of the future, and that is what I'm going to call personalized default rules. Typically, what we're observing in the marketplace these days, in the public sector certainly, and to some extent in the private, is an impersonal default rule applying to all of a relevant population. But you could imagine a personalized default rule which in the limiting case would be designed specifically for you. So for savings and healthcare and privacy even, energy, the government or a private institution may know enough to devise a default rule that would fit you in particular and nobody else, subject to your opt-out. A personalized default rule obviously has advantages over impersonal. It is more suited to heterogeneity and diverse tastes. It might have many of the advantages of active choosing without the costs, that is accuracy, but it might impede learning and jeopardize privacy. And so it has a downside too. So I'm going to, in the second part of the remarks, go through the three possibilities and discuss which belongs in which context. If there's going to be a one-liner for the discussion of the triptych, it's that personalized default rules are the wave of the future, and rightly so, notwithstanding the evident risks. Okay, to fix ideas, I've given you three examples of the power of default rules. I'm going to give you three more just to get real clarity on the phenomenon. Privacy is, of course, something people are acutely interested in over the internet and elsewhere. You could imagine, with respect to your browser, a default setting that says, unless you indicate otherwise, everything's going to be anonymous. Or even, unless you indicate otherwise, once you go on certain websites, there's going to be no tracking. Or you could imagine a default rule that's just the opposite, that says that no anonymity, and there's going to be tracking, but you can default your way out of it. We know enough to know that notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of cultural diversity with respect to privacy, the default rule is going to be very powerful. If a website tells you you are defaulted into privacy unless you opt into information sharing, the number of people who are going to be opting in isn't going to be very high, right? If a website, on the other hand, has available opt-out of information sharing, people are likely to say, yeah, whatever, and stick with the non-privacy protective regime. We know enough from experimental and other studies to know that the default setting, and the website provider are completely aware of this, is a very powerful indicator of what the outcome is going to be. A few years ago, I did an experiment with University of Chicago law students to try to figure out whether default rules would actually matter in an area in which law students have a lot of information. That is vacation time, comparing that to money. So I asked them a question in which a bunch of them were told, in your state, you get a mandatory minimum number of weeks, but you have 2 additional weeks which are not mandatory. The employer can buy them back from you. So you have 2 weeks for sure. You have 2 extra weeks which are defaultedly yours, but your employer can buy them. A bunch of other law students were given exactly the same question, but they were told, if you want to buy 2 extra weeks, you can from your employer. You have to give up some of your salary. The cases were exactly the same in terms of the starting income that students got. What came from the simple shift of the default rule for those 2 weeks was a massive difference in the financial compensation required or offered to get the 2 weeks. The median student would pay $6,000 to get 2 weeks. The median student would demand $13,000 to give up their 2 weeks. And that 13,000 number, in a way, lowballs the outcome of the experiment, because a number of first-year students said, there's no amount my employer could give me that would get me to give up my vacation time. That doubling is indicative of the general run of differences we see between willingness to pay and opt-in, opt-out. A few years ago, New Jersey and Pennsylvania had another natural experiment, not intentionally, it just so happened, with respect to insurance policies and the right to sue. And it turned out what people were defaulted into, whether they got the right to sue as they did in one state or had to buy it in the other state, completely mattered. It turned out to stick. And there's no reason to think that the citizens of Pennsylvania have systematically different preferences from the citizens of New Jersey with respect to the right to sue and insurance policies. This is a collection of findings that we now know is really robust, demonstrating the power of default rules. Why does this happen? There seem to be 3 different explanations, and in figuring out how to handle the case involving the maternal names problem and a few other cases where default rules aren't sticky, these diverse explanations really matter. Okay, the first, which I think is the most powerful, involves inertia and procrastination. To change a default rule, you have to make an active choice to reject it. You have to focus on the relevant question, whether a savings plan should be enrolled in, whether you should have green energy or not, or whether you would gain or lose from a privacy policy. This morning I was meeting with my publisher of a new book, has something to do with the topic of these remarks, and they wanted me to fill out an author questionnaire. It was so impossibly long that I just basically refused. Inertia prevailed. And while that's probably an extreme case, it just is a fact that if a default rule requires focus and attention to shift, people will frequently say, yeah, whatever, and just go about their business. There's evidence of the power of default rule by virtue of the power of inertia from an unlikely source, which has to do with television viewing. Their inertia exerts a very powerful force. As programs become more popular, the programs that follow them become more popular too, simply because the current channel is the default, and changing takes a little effort. A 10% increase in the popularity of the preceding program leads to a remarkable 2 to 3% increase in the audience for the following program. Stations exploit this behavior when scheduling their shows, and if they didn't, they'd lose up to 40% of their profits. For TV, it's pretty easy, right, to change. Opting in and opting out of default rules can be equally easy, but in many cases involves thinking and risk. People don't change because they don't want to engage in that thinking and take that risk. Or if they do, they'll decide they'll do it tomorrow, which never comes. Here's the second factor. Suppose the default choice, as in the 2 counties in Germany, is green energy, and that you're asked whether you want to shift. You might think to yourself, not that inertia is going to drive my behavior. You might really care about this. But you might think to yourself that experts or sensible people believe that this is the right course of action. This is a claim about the implicit endorsement from people who are trusted that comes from the default rule. Especially if people lack experience or expertise, they might just defer to what has been chosen for them. There's a testable hypothesis that comes from this idea, which is if choosers don't trust the choice architect, they're going to be far more likely to opt out. If you think that the person who's setting up the default rule is untrustworthy, then the likelihood is on this explanation that you'll shift, though on the inertia explanation, you're just going to go about your business, okay? But it seems to be the case that for many, especially for a technical area, there's an implicit endorsement, and that outweighs whatever private information they might have, so they stick. Third, I think, is the most interesting, which has to do with the reference point and the behavioral finding of loss aversion. And to see how loss aversion works, consider a recent study of incentives for teachers. It's an ingenious study that's motivated by the fact that if teachers are given economic incentives for getting their students to do better, the results are really mixed. So if in secondary schools you say to teachers, you'll get a $50 bonus or a $500 bonus if your students perform better, we're not seeing great results from those outcomes. Very mixed. And one implication of that might be that teachers aren't really motivated by the money. There's other stuff going on, and so economic incentives, forget about it. A very sad sentence for a former University of Chicago professor to utter, even by way of venturing a hypothesis. Here's the ingenious study. The teachers were given the money up front and told if the students don't show real improvement, the teachers have to give the money back. Under that study, there's a huge increase in math scores. Indeed, an increase equivalent to a substantial across-the-board improvement in teacher quality. The underlying idea here, which is vindicated by many experiments, is that losses from the status quo are really unwelcome, and people are going to work hard to avoid those losses. For default rules, the idea is what counts as a loss and what counts as a gain depends on the reference point, which the default rule establishes. If employees are getting $5,000 a month in take-home salary and ask whether they want to give $200 to savings, that sounds like a pretty bad deal. You're losing $200 of your money going into some savings plan. But if you're receiving $4,800 in wages and $200 is now going into savings, and you're asked whether you want those $200 to go into savings to go into take-home salary, say, I don't want to lose my savings. And that tends to work. Loss aversion, this is the behavioral finding that's being manipulated here, has been shown in the context of energy use and environmental protection outside of the domain of Germany. If people are asked whether they want to shift from a default in favor of energy-efficient light bulbs, they say, no, stick with my energy-efficient light bulbs, even if they cost a bit more up front because of the savings they give over time. But if people are asked whether they're going to buy energy-efficient light bulbs, which cost more up front and save them money over time, they're more likely to say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to energy-efficient light bulbs. Okay, that's the basic account of the power of default rules and the reasons. When don't they stick? For marital names, we can imagine a lot of alternatives to the status quo, which is that men and women both retain their names. That's the status quo. We could imagine the husband's name changes to that of his wife, and the wife's name sticks. Could imagine that as the default. We could imagine hyphenation as the default. We could imagine what's sometimes called a penalty default, where the spouse's names are changed to something crazy, where they would probably opt out. In the overwhelming majority of cases, men do stick with the default. Women don't. About 80% of the time they shift. Why doesn't it stick for women? This is a very complicated question. I want to make just 3 points. The third is the most complicated. First, the issue is highly salient, and because marriage is a defining event, the timing of the required action is relatively clear as a social matter at least. Okay, the timing is well defined, as it frequently isn't for other things where you might shift. Second, the changes of name is for some or many of the women who do it a kind of celebration. It's not the sort of activity that people seek to defer. Third, and the most delicate and I think interesting, is that many women undoubtedly affected by social norms, and in some cases pressures, affirmatively want, bracketing the complexity of the word want in this context, to change their names, and their desire isn't, their all things considered desire isn't unclear. This isn't a complicated or unfamiliar area in which people don't know what their preferences are. If you get these three things, clear timing, positive feelings about opt-in, and all things considered unambiguous preferences, the default rule isn't likely to matter much. It follows that if employers are enrolled into a plan that puts a huge amount of their income into savings or into the nation's treasury, even with the fiscal cliff looming, or 20% of their income into their worst enemy's savings account, or 10% into, pardon the word, the toilet, that's not going to stick. People will opt out. A study in the United Kingdom, which has a whole unit called the Behavioral Insights Team, which is very much focused on behavioral economics and public policy, the United Kingdom found that people opted out in big numbers in a savings plan with an unusually high default contribution rate. That suggests that the power of suggestion or endorsement is going to be limited, and that inertia will be overcome in which self-interest is palpably at stake. A more puzzling implication of the study just described is that people with low incomes were most likely to stick with the default. Okay? In that case, where there was a somewhat punitive and puzzling default, people with low incomes were particularly likely to stick, which suggests the manipulative nature of defaults can be especially insidious when you're dealing with people who were, for one another reason, most vulnerable. One reason is that people with low income have a lot to worry about. Eldar Shafir of this university has done some spectacular work on that topic, and so they may be less likely to take the trouble to think through and alter the default. Another possibility is that they may lack confidence in their own judgments, so they allow the default rule to stick. Okay, in some situations, defaults aren't going to stick, not because people are going to choose to, on their own hook, to opt out, but because self-interested people have a strong incentive to promote opt-out. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. Governments, many of them all over the world, as well as private institutions, are often thinking in a public-spirited way, how can I design choice architecture so it's helpful for people? If there's a default rule that's currently causing trouble, what can I do that'll make things easier and better? Now, if the evidence given thus far is generalizable, this is an extremely good strategy. But there are contexts in which it's not going to work. The first is where people have clear preferences, but then the original initiative, the choice architecture question, why am I trying to override people's clear preferences? The second is the more interesting one. When the choice architect is working with an institution which has a self-interest in getting the default rule to go away. This isn't hypothetical. In 2010, the Federal Reserve tried to protect people from bank overdraft fees. This is a good thing to try to protect people from, because for customers, and especially low-income customers, it's not great to end up taking the equivalent of a high-interest loan, indeed loans with interest rates of up to 7,000%. In principle, the regulation, which requires account holders explicitly to opt out and enroll in the overdraft program, rather than to be defaulted into it, the pre-existing situation. This was motivated on the Federal Reserve's part by a keen understanding of the power of the default rule. But the available evidence suggests that the effect of the Federal Reserve's effort is turning out to be really modest, and people are opting out in large numbers. And that can't be explainable in the way that the marital names case is explainable, or the crazy you know, you're defaulted into giving a lot of your savings to your worst enemy is explainable. There has to be something else going on. A central reason appears to be that the banks who are subject to the regulation hate it, want to be able to charge overdraft fees, and have used a number of tools to facilitate opt-out. What they've done, in a way that's behaviorally ingenious, is to exploit loss aversion in particular to encourage account holders to think that they will lose money unless they opt out. Here's an excerpt from one bank's marketing materials, explicitly using loss aversion, as in the teacher study. Check 1. Yes, keep my account working the same with Share Plus ATM and debit card overcharge coverage. No, change my account to remove Share Plus ATM and debit card overdraft coverage. Got it? Loss aversion. One bank employee says people are scared of change, so they'll opt in to overdraft to avoid it. There's a big contrast here with the retirement context. That's the success story, in which regulated institutions have been supportive of automatic enrollment. They like it. It's in their economic interest. The larger lesson is that it may sometimes be necessary to take further steps to make the default rule sticky if those who are affected by it have a strong economic interest in shifting it. Okay, a big background question on which I'm just going to say a little bit is how do you choose a default rule? People have a lot of different social commitments. Some people are focused on economic efficiency. Some people want to choose the default rule that's most fair or just. Others want to maximize social welfare, would have a utilitarian framework maybe, and choose accordingly. I want to bracket the deepest questions and see if it's possible to at least have a first cut at an incompletely theorized agreement on a preferred approach, where what's meant by the idea of an incompletely theorized agreement is an approach that can be chosen by people who have diverse theoretical commitments. And the basic idea here is to select the default rule that reflects what most people would choose if they were adequately informed. And the simple notion here is that if you like economic efficiency, you're going to be fine with that. If you care about what's fair, that seems to fit. Certainly is associated with the social contract tradition, which is our foundation for much of our thinking about fairness. And if you're interested in social welfare in a way that goes beyond economic efficiency, that's going to be just fine. If you're a freedom of contract person focused on individual autonomy, that's going to be a hard approach to beat. Now, there's going to be a lot of work that has to be done to identify what that approach is, and actual evidence about informed choice is going to be really important. Okay, let's turn from that issue to the leading alternative to a default rule, which is active choosing. The idea here, which is meant as an attack on what we might think of one understanding of the nudge agenda, is to say, let's not nudge, let's just favor freedom of choice. And the idea would be, there's a background, ungainly term, which Richard Thaler and I worked with for many years, Libertarian Paternalism. And the idea behind Libertarian Paternalism is you like approaches that are preservative of liberty. They allow people to go their own way, but they're paternalistic in the sense that they move people in directions that promote their welfare. And the Libertarian Paternalist idea is backed by an insistence that some kind of nudge is generally inevitable because there's a choice architecture in the background of decision. You can't really avoid that. Okay, an objection to this set of claims pressed by Judge Douglas Ginsburg and many others in recent years is that you actually can avoid a default rule, and that's through active choosing. Here what you do is don't default people into anything, but just say that people have to decide, as between opt-out and opt-in, they must indicate their preferences. So you could say, for people who work for Princeton, once you start, you have to say what your savings plan is. We're not going to default you into anything. And maybe you're not even going to get a salary until you decide. Or you could say that we're not going to require you to opt in to an organ donation program, as I believe most states still do, nor are we going to do what Austria has done and require you to opt out. So if you want to have a driver's license, you have to tell us what your preference is. And we could imagine in multiple social domains, and maybe this will turn out to be the wave of the future, something on, one of you has a computer on, and I know it's, you're not looking at any news story there because the default rule is to listen, and you're clearly listening. You go on a website and they ask you a bunch of questions, and you can't do anything until you've answered the questions. That's an imaginable future. Okay, what might be said in favor of active choosing? The first point is that all by itself it overcomes inertia. If inertia and procrastination are playing a big role, active choosing is better than opt-in. If people aren't signing up for plans that are in their interest because they're procrastinating, then active choosing solves the problem right away. It also might eliminate the problem of loss aversion immediately, because there's no reference point anymore against which people are going to lose or win. So active choosing has a kind of behavioral logic that it overcomes some cognitive problems. It's also a safeguard against what many people are worried about, which is uninformed or self-interested choice architects. If the choice architect, public or private, doesn't really know a lot about the relevant population, or if it's interested in its own wallet rather than the people with whom it's interacting, the idea of active choosing has big advantages. I don't know well enough about the privacy and internet dispute that's now going to have a view, but you may notice that on your Google browser, you can set your Chrome to incognito for that session. You can't set your Google Chrome browser to incognito generally. There must have been a reason for that, yes? And it may be that it's interest of browsers to have people use the browser to have their choices mapped so that you can, it's just going to click in once you type the first couple letters. But it may not. It may be in the interest of the people with whom Google is working. Who knows? I'm sure there's an account there, and it's probably an interesting one. The only point is that if self-interested choice architects are operating, active choosing is good. Finally, and I think this is the most important point, active choosing handles diversity as impersonal default rules can't. A single approach is unlikely to serve diverse circumstances. If one size doesn't fit all for health insurance or savings, then choice architectures might want to insist that people must make choices on their own. In the face of diversity, the impersonal default rule is especially dangerous because the power of inertia or the force of suggestion, think of the low-income people in the not very helpful savings plan, end up getting stuck in a situation that's not in their interest. Okay, notwithstanding its potential benefits, active choosing can also create big problems. And to see why, I'm going to go a little bit far afield and just give you a brief quotation from Esther Duflo, one of the world's leading experts on poverty. Here's the quotation. We tend to be patronizing about the poor in a very specific sense, which is that we tend to think, why don't they take more responsibility for their lives? And what we are forgetting is that the richer you are, the less responsibility you need to take for your own life because everything is taken care for you. And the poorer you are, the more you have to be responsible for everything about your life. Stop berating people for not being responsible and start to think of ways instead of providing the poor with the luxury that we all have, which is that a lot of decisions are taken for us. If we do nothing, we are on the right track. For most of the poor, if they do nothing, they are on the wrong track. Now, Duflo is not talking in particular about default rules, but we can understand what she's saying to be very much about exactly that. It's about what track are you on if you do nothing? The claim is that people who are well off do not have to be responsible for a wide range of things because others are making the relevant decisions, often through default rules for their benefit. In countless domains, ways we don't even have to think about, thank goodness, choices are taken for us. And in a sense, and this is the key point, that fact even promotes our autonomy, which is the favorite word of the active choice files. That promotes our autonomy because we're freed up to spend our time on other matters. Okay, to take it down to earth a little bit, active choosing can impose big burdens on choosers, a burden that may be unwelcome. If the situation is unfamiliar and complicated, and if you lack information and experience, active choosing can produce pointless red tape and a lot of frustration. Most consumers wouldn't like it a lot if at the time of purchase they had to select every feature of their cell phone plan or all of their computer's initial settings. The existence of defaults saves each of us a ton of time, and most of the defaults, if the market's working even a little bit well, are going to be sensible and suitable. Few of us would like to take the time to obtain the information to decide all of the choices we have to make. As compared with the default rule, active choosing increases the cost of decisions possibly significantly. Not only are choosers at risk from active choosing, it's a big problem potentially for providers too. If you're providing goods and services, you like defaults if you don't have to spend time and money giving patient, tedious explanations and going through the various options with consumers or users who might not welcome the exercise. A speculation which doesn't have empirical support, there are empiricists in the room, maybe one of you can do this to see if this is true, is the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who like IKEA and those who hate IKEA. If you're in the part of the world that hates IKEA, you will be made very nervous by active choosing. The last point, beyond the burdens on choosers and the burdens on producers, is that active choosing can increase errors. The whole goal of active choosing is to make people better off, but if the area is unfamiliar and technical, active choosing could have exactly the opposite effect. Okay, the third part of the triptych is personalized default rules. Some default rules are designed for individuals and not for masses. They are specifically tailored to particular individuals. At least in general and in principle, the design of personalized defaults would be a great boon. The key advantage is they're likely to be a whole lot more accurate and therefore beneficial than the mass impersonal defaults. As technology evolves and information accumulates, it should be increasingly possible to produce default rules that are based on individuals' own choices and situations. If this seems a little science fictional, and every day it seems less so, consider the fact that, basically every couple of hours, people who are friends and family members are using the equivalent of personalized default rules. They tend to know what you like in various domains, and with respect to conversation, food, restaurants, vacations, and more, they use those personalized defaults to each of our benefit. That's what a family member or friend really is like. They don't ask, in every case, for an active choice, which would make life more complicated and maybe intolerable. Spouses sometimes order for one another at restaurants or select clothing for them using the functional equivalent of default rules and pursuant to an implicit delegation. Indeed, a large part of what it means to be a spouse, a partner, or a close friend is to be able to identify such defaults. Strangers, by contrast, rely on impersonal ones, people you're just getting to know, and they can cause big trouble. Yes? A personalized default could be based on, as noted, people's individual choices or the choices of people like you. Amazon.com knows if you like mysteries by Robert Parker. He died, but he's still great. You'll probably like Mysteries by Lee Child also. Are these names ringing a bell or too stupid for Princeton? Robert Parker, Lee Child, they're both very good. Amazon.com isn't quite creating default rules, but they're creating visible salient choices on the basis of what they know about you. If information is available about any of us, choice architects could design for any of us default rules for health insurance, rental car agreements, computer settings, and a lot more. Indeed, if you think about it a bit, personalized defaults are increasingly becoming common and familiar. If a website knows where you like to sit on an airplane and how you like to pay, it can use that knowledge to generate outcomes subject to your revision. It's a default rule. Personalized default rules can also be dynamic. The best default settings for you for 2012 might not be the same as for 2013. Multiple websites are fast moving in this direction, providing defaults for people based on their own past choices. And in fact, a primary initiative of the Obama administration, this one I will mention, is called the Smart Disclosure Initiative. And the idea based on a memorandum I issued, which a lot of people worked on, is that let's get disclosure out to the American people so that the private sector and the public sector too, if that's desirable, can provide you information about your own past choices so you can make better choices in the future. So you can get immediate access in a way that you can read and understand to your energy choices or your choices with respect to healthcare. And that can eventually feed into information that you can use to decide what choices to make in the future. You might find that your choices with respect to healthcare and energy or credit cards or school loans haven't been ideal. And if there's smart disclosure from private and public institutions, you can get it and make that comparison and make the market work a lot better. Okay, in the limiting case, the default's based on people's own past choices. In other cases, they might involve a degree of extrapolation from those choices. The choice architect might know if you like these sorts of things, you'll like those sorts of things too. And one interesting question is what degree of extrapolation turns out to be accurate, even in the face of seeming separation between what's being extrapolated from and extrapolated to. Yes? If they know you like, for example, Mumford & Sons, do you know Mumford & Sons? What kind of group is this? If they know that you like the Beatles, you know, then you'll also like Rodriguez. Okay, got to see Searching for Sugar Man. If you like the Beatles, you like the Rolling Stones. Okay, we'll keep it simple. There's extrapolation. If sufficient data are available about choices, personalized default rules might be generated in this way. Okay, there are obviously two challenges for the personalized default rule. One is information acquisition and the other is privacy. And all I'm going to say about that is that for information acquisition, it may be that many institutions just don't know enough to be able to personalize. And for others, there's an acute risk that if they're personalizing, they are invading your privacy. The simplest solution to the latter problem is either to have a privacy protective impersonal default rule, if that's necessary to keep people's information private, or a little fancier, to use the power of personalization to protect privacy too. Meaning, if institutions know that you are acutely concerned about your privacy, then personalization will be limited by the fact that your information is going to be walled off. If you're the sort of person who doesn't care much about whether websites know what you've been buying on other, you generally know. So personalization can suit individual needs generally. It can be a safeguard against privacy intrusive uses of personalization. It can be personalized too. And if you're worried that there might not be sufficient information about your privacy preferences to build a privacy protective default rule for you, well, then we could have an impersonal default, which is privacy protective, which will be overcome if that's the sort of person you are. Less ambitious than this would be demographic or geographical variables to promote personalization. of the sort that universities are already doing for faculty members for retirement plans. If someone's 30, they're going to be defaulted into a different plan for the plan they'll be defaulted into in which it's their 60. Evidence suggests that default rules for retirement that respect diversity, at least with respect to age, are feasible, and that they're significantly increasing the probability of enrollment and creating big gains for participants. Okay, it's time to conclude, and the conclusion is going to have an argument in it. Whether or not we notice them, default rules are omnipresent. They establish settings for countless activities and goods, basically everything under the sun. They identify and fix the consequences if choosers do nothing. And above all, because of the power of inertia, with an assist from endorsement and loss aversion, default rules tend to stick. Here's the argument. When the relevant group is not diverse or relevantly diverse, when an impersonal default rule is going to satisfy its informed preferences, it's most sensible to select that default rule rather than to require active choosing. If the group is not heterogeneous in any relevant sense, if an impersonal default rule is going to satisfy their preferences, select the default rule rather than require active choosing. If the issue is complicated and unfamiliar, active choosing is going to be a benefit, not a burden. But if the group is relevantly diverse, when choosing is actually affirmatively preferred, people like it rather than hate it, and when private or public institutions can't be trusted or lack good information about which default rule is best, then go for active choosing. So the idea is there are some situations that are like going to restaurants for many people where you like to make the choice. Then default rules seem less attractive. Like when you go to restaurants, often diversity is there, and that's a context where an impersonal default rule is no good. The question, the choice I'm posing now between the impersonal default rule and active choosing involves the costs of decisions and costs of errors. That's our little framework. Personalized default rules might reduce the problem associated with one-size-fits-all defaults and so provide most of the benefits of active choosing, at least if the relevant choice architects are informed and trustworthy. So here the idea is personalized default rules have almost all of the advantages of active choosing when the choice architects are knowledgeable and trustworthy. And so that's a lot better than an impersonal default rule, and it's better than active choosing too. I use the word almost for a reason. If it's a domain where individual learning is desirable and not kind of a pointless headache, then we'll want to go for active choosing and not personalized default rules. In many domains, and this is the final point, personalized default rules just are the wave of the future, and we should expect to see a significant increase in personalization as information becomes increasingly available about the informed choices of diverse people. Thanks. You can ask about anything. Even the Chicago Bears' spectacular victory yesterday, if you want.
So I had a quick comment and a question. First of all, as someone who's investigated the New Jersey auto insurance trial coverage issue, to me it seems like an issue like the Federal Reserve and the overdraft charges. They make it almost impossible to figure the situation out. If you're really interested in using it as an example, I'd look at some of the forms that they provide. I have a question about using choice architecture for end-of-life decisions. It's baffled me that with the extraordinary costs associated with end-of-life healthcare, that we're not forced to make choices affirmatively to seek that care. And I was wondering if you could help me understand the larger discussions that might be going on around that issue.
Okay, anything that involves what the Obama administration might have done.
Insurance company.
Yeah, so on end of life, I should say, that's not an issue I've devoted a lot of attention to, so except in personal context, but so I don't have a lot to say about that. Your first point's really important, and you said it quickly, so I want to underline it, and it's in some, it's either a correction to what I said or a very helpful amendment, which is the suggestion was in the Philadelphia, New Jersey case, with which I gave, and the bank overdraft case, complexity, the questioner suggests, is the problem, not so much the default rule. And she may well be right on that. It's certainly the case that complexity can make a default rule stickier. If you make it very confusing for people to know how to shift or whether to shift, then the likelihood that they'll stick goes up because inertia becomes far more attractive because it's just a big bother to figure out whether to shift. So that's a very important point. Default rules are sticky even when it's simple to shift, but there's no question that some and maybe all of the reasons why default rules sticky start to be in bold letters when complexity is simultaneously present. So you can think of one-click defaults and 8-click defaults, and guess which one's going to be stickier. So that, you're completely right on that.
Hi, I just had a question about personal default rules, and do you see any potential ethical issues there, given that so often people's preferences don't necessarily line up with what someone might objectively view as their best interest? So if people have made increasingly perhaps poor choices for whatever reason, habit, they don't know that they're bad choices, how do you account for that in an algorithm that's trying to decide what's...
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I have a piece of an answer, but it's not going to be adequate. So I'll try a little bit to get at what you're pointing to. Okay, you might have a case where for the state to institutionalize a default runs up against some sort of social or constitutional norm. So you could imagine if men and women have systematically different preferences or people of different racial or religious groups and the state encodes those in default rules for them, that might run up against a norm that is even constitutional in status. And then that's just a fact, and it's a kind of decisive fact. And then there's an interesting question, why is there a norm that forbids the state from just piggybacking on what people in the private sector are doing? And that's a very interesting question. It must be something about some norm of equality across some sphere, which private preferences are awkwardly fitting with, something like that. I think your question is deeper than that. What if you have a bunch of people who are systematically making choices that just aren't in their interest? And then the default was just building on that. Now the kind of quick answer is it has to be an informed choice. So it's not, the default rule doesn't fit with the preferences, it fits with the informed preferences. So if people are systematically, choosing something that ends up being not in their interest, and we're not speculating when we say that, we just know that, and the people themselves who live with the consequences of their choice face that, then we might be in business. But what I've just said might lead to a cheap victory, because the word informed is doing a lot of work in the answer, and whether an informed preference is different from the choice architecture's conception of what's in people's best interest, we'd hope there would be a line there. So I think the way to do it, the way to make more progress than I'm doing right now, is to build up from individual cases and see if we can think of cases where people are making preferences, making choices, even with information that's not in the interest. They're just, why is that exactly? I'm thinking there's Princeton professor Joel Waldfogel has written a book called Scroogenomics. You know this book? It's the season for it. The book is about how there's something like well over $10 billion in annual waste for winter holiday giving, because people aren't making good choices for the people for whom they're giving gifts. And those are informed judgments, right? This is made by family members and friends, and they're getting people a bowl, and people say, I don't want that bowl. Or they know that person who gets the bowl. So the example, which is the people are making those choices for people they love well enough, or like well enough, or want to become friends with well enough to get a present for them, they know them, and they're still making mistakes. So we wanted, I think it would have to be open to a behaviorally interested observer to at least to investigate the question whether even the informed choices are going sour. But you want to be very careful about that, because the choice architect may have their own biases and blind spots also.
Yeah, that's just the point, isn't it? That isn't it preferable for people, individuals, to make the wrong choice than have the choice architects, who some people might think might be robber barons, make the choice that is economically advantageous to them and not to the consumer. So if I had to opt in or opt out for the public making the wrong choice, I say wrong choice rather than the choice architect becoming a robber baron, which unfortunately in a capitalistic society, not to use the Lockean comparison, but tends to be, I would think, the norm rather than the exception. So I would, if I were overly argumentative, which I will be, I would say perhaps your whole scenario is a bit naive. And in that maybe we should impose a Lockean view and say that the public has to be protected against the choice architects.
Okay, there's a lot there. So I think, okay, one way to put your point, I think, might be that of the three alternatives in personal defaults, active choosing, and personalized defaults, active choosing should have 5 stars next to it. Because
precisely, would be for the very reason that you cited in your talk,
right.
And that's trustworthiness. And I would say, unfortunately, in our society, it tends to be the Lockean imperative, and maybe we should trust but verify with an emphasis on verify.
Okay, I think we'd want to make a distinction between private sector choice architects and public sector choice architects, which have different constraints and safeguards built into them. So a private sector choice architect, let's say it's a rental car company, that defaults you into all sorts of warranties and insurance policies that are really bad. There are 2 things that are going to happen to that rental car company. One is that people are going to opt out a lot. And to the extent that they don't, that company is going to lose customers and get a reputation as a thief. So
but if you've ever rented a car recently, you know that those opt-out rules, I mean, the people are actually incented at the counter to make a decision that's against their will, and to the point where they're lied to.
I think we need to do a lot of investigating of the particular context to make a judgment about any particular context. All I want to say is that the public sector choice architects have the constraint of accountability, and the private sector choice architects have the constraint of market pressures. And then there's a question with what confidence can we rely on either of those to be adequate. I think the most that I think could be made of your point is to say that because if we're deep skeptics, let's say, about the effect of market forces, which I'm not, University of Chicago, proudly, not a deep skeptic, not a trust but verify, so not rose-colored glasses, but the systematic misuse of default rules to make life worse for consumers. That would be surprising in a competitive system, though to see it not infrequently would not be surprising. But to the extent that you're deeply skeptical of free markets, or to the extent that you're deeply skeptical of democratic institutions, you would want active choosing a lot. I think Deflo's point is a very powerful qualification to that argument. Because to get through a day, even an hour, in a world of active choosing, it's not feasible. If you look at that microphone and those stairs and the thing on which you're resting your elbow, you're defaulted into all of those things. You didn't choose a single one. And I mean, I don't know if you work at Princeton, but Princeton has set stuff up. And a lot of it, thank goodness, you can opt out of. But if you had to choose actively with respect to each of them, I don't know where I literally don't know where you'd be. You'd be thinking what to choose right now. And where would you be doing that? Not in this room. So I think the point that Flo makes, which is about poverty and wealth, I think it is a deep point about the extent to which default rules are all around us. And that's autonomy. In some ways it's autonomy reducing, but it's otherwise autonomy promoting because we get to stand somewhere.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my understanding is that under your leadership of OIRA, you focused on assessing the benefits and costs of potential regulations. And I think one potential concern with that is that some costs are a lot easier to measure than others. Like, it's easier to tell how much an environmental regulation will cost a firm than how much risk it does to its employees to be exposed to dangerous chemicals. And I was wondering what you would say on how we can improve measurement of these costs that are hard to measure in order to not under-regulate things that would benefit consumers.
Okay, so it is true that the president is very supportive of cost-benefit analysis, and Executive Order 13563, which is, you all know Executive Order 13563, which is it's a little like a constitution for the regulatory state. The president issued in January of 2011, and it's very firmly on the side of cost-benefit analysis. I'll give you a little data, cost-benefit-y data. The first 3 years of the Bush administration, the net benefits of regulations were about $3.4 billion. That's very impressive. That's not millions, that's billions. And the Bush administration, not ordinarily thought to be, regulatory zealots, they produced very big benefits. Most of those are public health benefits, by the way. The Clinton administration, in its first 3 years, did even better. They're around, I think around $13 billion, certainly north of 10 in net benefits. That's extraordinary, and against public health benefits, the so-called hard to quantify, both Bush and Clinton quantified them, and they're very high. The Obama administration through 3 years was not at 3.4 and not at 13, but at over 91 billion through 3 years. And as of this date, we're significantly higher than 91 billion, well over 100 billion in net benefits. Now, some of that is the easy to quantify stuff like deregulation that just takes costs away. But a lot of it's driven by environmental benefits, air quality benefits, which have been monetized. So you're right that it's challenging to monetize, but there have been now, with the help of Dean Rouse, there have been techniques developed to monetize the hard to quantify, including emphatically the environmental public health benefits. And a very large chunk of that, 91 billion, are public health benefits. Some are purely economic. So I don't believe that cost-benefit analysis has led in a systematic way to under-regulation. Though I agree with you that if things that couldn't be quantified were treated as if they were worth zero, then that would lead to under-regulation. Here's what happens. If there's a value that's not easy to quantify, either because you don't have a monetary equivalent for, let's say, water quality, which is, let's say, not going to produce public health benefits, but just going to produce cleaner water, not that you're going to drink, but that's going to exist. That'll be ecologically a good thing. Well, let's suppose you have a rule that gets people who are in wheelchairs into buildings, and that will have some economic benefits because they'll be productive and they'll, produce economic goods and maybe buy things once they're in the buildings, but also they're going to be able to use the bathrooms. And some of the reason you let disabled people have wheelchair accessible bathrooms has nothing to do with what's easily monetized. It's about dignity, yes? And so what the Obama administration did in the wheelchair case was just to call out the consideration of human dignity and to say that has a value that the economic factors aren't capturing. And the president's executive order actually uses the word human, first time in the history of, I think, this or any other country that an executive order on regulation uses the words human dignity and says those are to be considered. Now, for cost benefit, there's a challenge, which is human dignity is in some deep sense priceless, but is in some important, very superficial sense not priceless, if you get me. I mean, it is in a deep sense priceless. To live in the world and see it as having a price deepest in your heart, that wouldn't be so good. But to see human dignity as infinitely valuable, we may be swallowing up dollars that could be better used elsewhere in a hurry. So what we did in the Obama administration for the non-quantifiable, and this is, I'm sure there's more and better to be done, is what's called break-even analysis. So you think, your case, is some environmental good that you can't really quantify. It's cleaner rivers, let's suppose, without any human health benefits or even recreational benefits. How much would the value of that additional cleanness of the waters have to be in order for it to be worthwhile? Now, if you have one little river that's really small, and that's the only one that's going to be cleaned up, and the cost is $400 million annually, we don't have a disciplined method for saying that that's not justified, but some reflection suggests that's going to be a hard one. But suppose you have, tens of thousands of rivers that are going to be a lot cleaner, and on a per river basis, it's not that expensive. The aggregate cost is not trivial. The cost would have to be that for it to be justified, and maybe it is. So that's the way it's approached now. I think from economists and others, there's a lot to be learned over the next 20, 25 years. We had a rule involving prison rape, where a very, quantitative economic analysis was done. And a lot of people made fun of it for a prison rape rule. But the president's executive order calls for economic analysis. But the Department of Justice was very clear that this is not, all the rules about it. It's about dignity. Being raped is not about dollar equivalents. It's about something else that has qualitatively distinctive. And that's, the Obama administration, I'm sure, has done more than any other administration to be very explicit about non-quantifiable variables and say that they can justify costs. The executive order, the president's executive order, doesn't say that the benefits have to outweigh the costs. It has to justify the costs. So there may be non-monetizable that are justificatory.
So in the three options you put forward, there were sort of personalized default choices, impersonal default choices, and active choice. But I was wondering, have there been any sort of significant instances of people trying to devise active choice mechanisms by which some options are sort of more easily presented than others? Because even in an active choice setup, there are some implicitly preferred options simply through things like how they're ordered on a page and so forth. So you brought up the example of, say, Amazon. Does anyone use sort of an Amazon-like algorithm to present options in which you more realistically have to choose one, assuming you're not like crazy about free shipping?
No. That's great. Okay, if everyone got that question, the question suggests that the active choice and default rules needn't be seen as dichotomous. You can actually have a continuum where active choices are described in a way that gets looking more like a default. And this is a frontiers question. There's actually some empirical evidence on it where what's described, I don't love the term, but you can maybe think of a better one. It's called enhanced active choice, which sounds a little Orwellian, because what's really meant is influence choice, where people have to make a decision, but something is portrayed as a loss from the status quo? Would you like to lose your right to blah, blah? Or would you like to maintain your right? You have to choose. And all of the behavioral findings could be enlisted to, quote, enhance, unquote, active choices. The empirical evidence suggests if you use loss aversion as part of active choices, right? Do you want to lose this or maintain it? It's going to work a little like a default rule. It's going to push people pretty hard in the direction of the one that's described. And I'm sure you're right that the order will, at least in some cases, matter. The color will matter. Right? If one is green and the other red, that may well have an effect. If one's in bold and the other in italics. So absolutely. And what's really interesting about your question is, okay, so there are stylized reasons that you would choose active choosing over default rules, and the question suggested distrust of the choice architect. You might think if it's a really close call, you're going with active choosing, but you're really worried that it's a technical area where people are going to screw up, witness the first question, you might want influenced active choice. Or if you think with another prior questioner that these choice architects really can't be trusted, that they're just going to be trying to pad their own wallets, then you're not going to allow that. You're going to want to portray it as neutrally as possible. Now, I guess your question, the coolness of your question is that the behavioral objection is as neutrally as possible is a little, pardon the word, naive, because you need framing, and that you can work toward neutrality, but you can't easily avoid at least some influence, if only because one of the questions has to be the first question.
Last two questions?
I mean, my question was on dealing with the cases where you have a very technical issue, but you don't trust the choice architect, which you just said.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so no, that's great. So the factors pull in different directions. There's a technical issue.
Government regulation where it's received a bad rap in the press, so you just don't trust the choice. But
oh, you
the choice
don't?
needs to be made something.
I see. Okay. Okay. Great. So you're pulling the factors apart. You have an issue that's technical and complicated. People hate choosing, want a default, need a default. But they don't trust the choice architect. Okay, I think even though the choice architect is in fact trustworthy, I think that's case one. Case two, they don't trust the choice architect, and they're right. Okay.
The TSA pack house. You can get standard radiation or you can get growth.
Right.
Who's the choice architect there, and should they be trusted?
Okay, so in your first case, I think a little easier to handle. If the choice architect is in fact trustworthy, and the issue is technical and complicated, the first cut thing would be to try to explain that the distrust is unwarranted. The case where the choice architect is untrustworthy and it's technical and complicated, we'd want, wouldn't we, active choosing there? Because the default is just bad for people. And maybe it would be better if it's really technical and complicated to, if you have a market, I mean, maybe they're fraudulent choice architects. Okay, so one thing that's kind of close to your example is there's something called negative option marketing, where you get this great deal on a hotel room. You go to the best hotel in New York City, and it only costs you $80 a night from some company. And what you kind of have been told, but you don't really get, is you're now enrolled in the company's, wonderful hotel deal program, for which you pay $15 a month, and it's on your credit card. This happens. So I was victimized by something not fraudulent, and it's completely my fault, where my credit card company told me about 23 years ago, you can have 5 magazines of your choice for free for 3 months. That's great. Yes? It was a great credit card deal. That's a nice credit card company. So I got the 5 magazines, and then 20 years later, I was subscribing to all of them. And I paid for them for 19 years and 9 months. And it was only government employment, where my salary went down, that convinced me to call them up and say, please stop sending me these magazines. And that's a case of the actually untrustworthy choice architect, and what the Federal Trade Commission is trying to do something about that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So from where I'm standing, it seems as though these insights from behavioral economics are gaining currency in the policy realm. So your work in the White House, we study your book in the MPA program, and you mentioned the UK Behavioral Insights team. I'm kind of curious about the conversation happening in Washington about behavioral economics and defaults, and there are a lot of policy issues where it seems like an obvious win for the public. You know, organ donation is a good example. What do you think it takes to overcome the inertia we see in the legislature to make those kinds of changes?
Well, we want to go issue by issue, wouldn't we? Peter Orszag, I think his mother just left, who was here. Peter Orszag, who was head of OMB. I think when he was head of the Congressional Budget Office, he worked with Congress on automatic enrollment and savings plans. And Congress was highly receptive. It was bipartisan legislation. So that one, you know, if you call it behavioral economics, it sounds a little abstract and scary maybe. But if you say, you know, why not have automatic enrollment? It'll make it so that people do better. I was told, though I don't know for a fact, that there's a piece in the New York Times today talking about economic incentives for retirement not working. And it also says automatic enrollment does work. Senator Coburn, who is, you know, not a Democrat, was pushing in connection with the health reform debates automatic enrollment. So let's have employers automatically enroll people in health insurance. That's going to drive up coverage a lot. And so he, in that area, he completely got it. There's one rule from the United States Department of Agriculture. Kids in the United States who get school meals under the school lunch program, the school breakfast program, it's now I guess meals generally. And a lot of them don't get the food because signing up is complicated. It's an opt-in design, it's been. And it came from Congress, I believe, certainly with congressional authorization. Maybe it was a congressional requirement, something called direct certification, where if the kids are eligible for certain programs, the states know they're eligible for the lunch program too, and said you're in. You don't have to sign up. And there's one rule we did that's giving up to 260,000 children food that they're eligible for that they wouldn't otherwise be getting. So I think area by area is the, you know, the way to go. So a lot of these issues, I did a guidance document on simplification, and that often pays big dividends, and it's not something that Congress is ambivalent about. Congress likes, in the abstract certainly, sometimes complexity prevails, but in the abstract, simplification is a happy word.
Well, thank you.